The clock on the old bell tower was 3 seconds from the hour when I felt my own breath go shallow. And I understood, the way you understand a coming storm in your knees before the sky tells you, that the silence about to fall over the remembrance court was going to be tested. I stood second in the line that morning. Corwin Vale stood third to my right, and it is his stillness this whole account is about, though he would never have told it himself. We were 8 in the cordon, drawn up along the low granite wall that rings the court of the fallen standard, our backs to the carved names, our faces to the gathered. Behind us, 1,000 names of men and women of the house of Ardenmore who had not come home were cut into the stone in letters worn soft by rain. Before us, perhaps 400 people in dark coats, breath fogging, holding the kind of stillness that ordinary people can only hold for a minute, which was exactly all that was asked of them. 1 minute, that was the whole of it. When the bell struck the hour, the city would stop. The trams would halt at their stations. The flags along the processional would dip. And for 60 seconds in the cold November light, the living would give the dead the only thing the dead ever ask of us, which is to be remembered without distraction, without commerce, without a single careless word. I had stood that minute 11 times in my years on the wall. I have never once found it long. The bell struck. I felt the sound go through the soles of my boots. The first stroke is always the loudest, and after it the air seems to thicken, as if the whole court has drawn one breath and decided to hold it together. An old woman near the front pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. A boy in a school cap stood with his chin up, trying to be a man for his grandfather's name. Far off, beyond the gates, the traffic had already died. The pigeons settled. Somewhere a single flag rope tapped its pole, tick, tick, and then even that seemed to hush itself out of respect. 3 seconds in, I heard the laughing. It came from the East Arch, where the public spilled in from the avenue of lamps, and it was not the laughing of a man who knew where he was. It was loud, bright, careless, the laugh of someone whose whole attention is fixed on a small glowing rectangle in his hand. I could not turn my head. None of us could. But I have learned to see a great deal from the corner of an eye held perfectly level, and what I saw was a young man in an expensive gray coat, earpieces in, walking fast and talking faster, holding his phone out before him at arm's length as though the whole court of the fallen standard were a backdrop he had personally arranged. And that's the thing, right? You've just got to be there, you've got to capture it, the energy of a place. His voice carried the way a stone carries across a still pond. Every head in the front rows had gone rigid. The old woman's hand pressed harder. 40 seconds left. I have stood beside Corwin Vale for 6 years. I know the man's stillness the way a sailor knows the set of his own ship. When he is merely on duty, there is a faint life in him, the almost invisible sway a standing man cannot help, the slow tide of breath under the red wool. But when something tries to break the thing he is guarding, all of that goes away. He becomes, and I do not use the word lightly, a part of the architecture. I felt it happen beside me then, a kind of settling, as though he had quietly decided to become heavier than the granite at his back. The young man in the gray coat did not feel it. He had reached the edge of the gathered crowd now and was sweeping his phone in a slow arc, narrating. So this is some kind of memorial situation, I think. Everyone's being super quiet, which honestly makes for a great shot. A man in the crowd turned and hissed at him, a sharp, desperate sound, the sound a father makes when his child is about to run into a road. The young man laughed again, lifted a placating hand without lowering his phone, and kept talking. 30 seconds. This is the part that people who were not there have trouble understanding, so let me be plain about it. We were not permitted to move. Not to silence him, not to chase him, not even to turn and fix him with the look that might have done the work of 100 words. The orders for the silence are older than any of us, and they are absolute. The cordon holds. The cordon does not react. The whole meaning of the minute is that the dead are honored by men who will not be moved, and the instant one of us breaks formation to deal with a fool, the fool has won. He has made the silence about himself. So our discipline is not coldness. It is the last gift we can give. We hold so that the moment does not shatter, and we trust the moment itself to do what no shout of ours could. But a moment is a fragile thing. I felt it cracking. I felt 400 people's grief curdling into a thin, helpless anger, their heads beginning to turn from the names on the wall toward the noise at the arch, their 60 seconds being stolen from them, one careless syllable at a time. The old woman had begun, very slightly, to tremble. The boy in the school cap was looking at the young man now instead of at his grandfather's name, and there was a terrible confusion in his young face, as if the world had just taught him that the most sacred minute he had ever stood in could be undone by any man rude enough to try. 25 seconds. And then the young man stepped over the low chain that marked the inner court, the chain that exists for exactly one reason, and walked in among the standing mourners to get, I suppose, a better shot. I will tell you what I felt, because I was 3 feet from the man who did not feel it. I felt my own jaw tighten until it ached. I felt the heat climb up my neck under the chin strap, the old furious heat that every man in red wool learns to swallow in his first year and never fully stops tasting. I wanted to break the cordon. God help me. I wanted to step out of that line, cross the court in 5 strides, and put myself between that grinning, glowing carelessness and the old woman with the trembling hand, and I would have counted the discipline well spent. Corwin Vale did not move. He did not move, and I felt it, and the difference between his stillness and my own was the difference between a wall and a man pretending to be one. I was holding myself in place. He had simply become the place. And in that instant, with 20 seconds left and the whole minute teetering on the edge of ruin, I understood that he was not enduring the moment. He was carrying it. The whole weight of it, the names behind us and the grief before us, and the 60 seconds the city had promised its dead, all of it had somehow gathered onto the still point of one guardsman in the cold, and he had taken it up the way. A load-bearing column takes the roof, without complaint, without strain you could see, because that is simply what he was there to do. The young man raised his phone toward the carved names, and toward the old woman crying beneath them, and he opened his mouth to speak again. And then he turned, idly, the way a careless man turns when something at the edge of his vision finally registers, and he looked straight at Corwin Vale. Here is the thing no camera ever captures, the thing you have to have stood 3 feet away to know. Corwin was not glaring at him. He was not staring him down. His eyes were forward and level, fixed on the middle distance above the crowd the way ours are always fixed, looking at nothing and at everything, at the names and the cold air and the 60 seconds. He was not even, in any ordinary sense, aware of the young man, and that, I think, is what stopped the young man cold. Because we expect the world to react to us. We are raised on it. We make our noise and the noise comes back, and we mistake the echo for proof that we matter. The young man in the gray coat had spent, I would guess, the whole of his short life producing reactions. A loud word, a bright laugh, a thing held up to a lens, and always, the world turned to look. And here at last was a man it could not move. A man who would not flinch, would not frown, would not so much as acknowledge that the noise existed, and in the face of that the young man's whole performance suddenly had nowhere to land. I watched it happen on his face. The grin held a second too long, the way a grin does when it has stopped meaning anything. His phone, still raised, drifted a few degrees off the line of the names because his arm had forgotten its task. He looked at Corwin and waited for the reaction that is owed to every loud man, and none came. There was only the red wool and the still white glove on the rifle and the eyes that did not see him. And beyond that, the 500 names he had walked in among without ever once reading. 15 seconds. "Hey," the young man said, and his voice had dropped, lost its broadcast brightness, gone almost private. "Hey, mate, you're not even." He took half a step toward the cordon. I felt my own muscles ready themselves the way they do, and I felt Corwin not ready himself at all, because a wall does not ready itself. A wall is simply there. The young man stopped. He had meant, I think, to provoke the famous statue into being a statue for his audience, to get the little video the whole world has seen 100 times, the tourist grinning beside the unmoving guard. But you cannot make a clip of a man's stillness when the stillness is the point. You can only stand inside it and feel it close over your head and begin, against your will, to go quiet too. He lowered the phone. I do not know if he meant to. I think his arm simply gave up, the way a raised hand gives up when no one will take it. The little glowing rectangle came down to his side, and the bright sound of his own voice was gone, and for the first time since he had come through the East Arch, the young man in the gray coat was standing in the same silence as everyone else, and he could hear it. 10 seconds. That is the part I will carry to my own grave, not the disruption, the conversion. I have seen the silence broken before on lesser mornings by lesser men, and I have seen the cordon hold and the moment limp to its bitter end with everyone's jaw set in fury. This was different. This was the noise itself going still. The young man stood there with his arm down and his head slowly beginning to lift, and he looked past Corwin at last, past the red wool, to the wall of names he had been treating as a backdrop, and I watched him read one. Just one. I will never know which. But I saw his eyes catch on a single line of worn letters and stop, and I saw something move across his face that he had certainly not arrived with, and it was the oldest thing in the world. It was understanding what a place is. The old woman at the front was still weeping, but quietly now, the way you weep when you have been left alone with your grief again, when the thief has dropped what he was taking and stepped back. The boy in the school cap had turned his face back to the wall, to his grandfather's name, and his chin was up again. And Corwin Vale had not moved, had not spoken, had not unbent so much as a single degree, and yet he had reached every one of them. He had held the door of the minute shut with the whole of his stillness, and on the other side of that door the silence had simply gone on being whole, 60 seconds wide and unbroken, exactly as it had been promised to the dead. 5 seconds. The young man took off his earpieces. I saw him do it. He pulled them from his ears with a slow, almost shamed motion and closed them in his fist, and he stood up straight, and he looked at the names, and he waited out the last of the minute the way the rest of the living were waiting it out, having joined, without quite deciding to, the company of people who knew where they were standing. The bell struck the close of the hour. It is hard to describe what the end of a held silence feels like to a man inside the cordon. It is not relief exactly. It is more like watching a great weight set safely down. Around the court, 400 people let go of the breath they had been keeping, and the sound of it was like a tide drawing back over sand, soft and enormous. The flags came up from their dip. Far off beyond the gates a tram bell rang, and the city which had stopped began carefully to move again. The minute had held. Whatever else was true that morning, the minute had held, whole and unbroken, and the dead of the house of Ardenmore had been given, in full, the one thing we were there to give them. I let my own jaw unclench. I had not realized how hard I had been holding it. What happened next is the reason I am telling this at all, because I have stood many silences and I have never seen the next part before. The young man in the gray coat did not slink away. I had expected him to, the way the rude ones always do once the spell breaks, escaping before the shame can catch them. He did not. He stayed exactly where he was, inside the inner chain he should never have crossed. And as the crowd around him began to stir and murmur and reach for the hands of the people they had come with, he stood among them with his phone dark in his fist and his head bowed, and he did not move either. A steward in a dark coat was already crossing toward him, quick and grim, the kind of man whose whole morning had been ruined by this one fool, and who meant to put him out of the gate by the collar if it came to that. I saw the young man see him coming. I saw him brace for it. And I saw him do the thing that turned the whole morning from a story about a disruption into a story about a silence that would not let itself be broken. He raised his head, found Corwin Vale's unmoving face one more time, the only thing in that court that had not changed, and he said, into the new and ordinary noise of the dispersing crowd, in a voice that shook. "I'm sorry, I didn't," he stopped. He tried again. "I didn't know what this was." The steward halted a pace away, and the old woman at the front, the one who had wept with her gloved hand pressed to her mouth, turned around. She was small and very upright, the way women of a certain age and a certain grief are upright, as though the dignity were the only thing holding the body together. She looked at the young man for a long moment, and I confess I expected her, of all people, to be the one who would tear him apart, because the minute he had nearly stolen had plainly been hers, bought with a name on that wall. The whole court seemed to expect it too. The murmuring thinned. Even the steward waited. "What was your name?" she said. It was not a question the way most questions are. It was an old schoolteacher's question, a question that expected an answer and would wait all day for it. "Tomas," the young man said. "Tomas Reach." "Well, Mr. Reach," she studied him. "My husband stood where that young man is standing." She lifted her chin a fraction toward the cordon, toward Corwin. 60 years gone, and he stood that wall in weather that would freeze the words in your throat, and never once moved, because he believed that the dead are owed our stillness. He's on that wall now, the third column, 11th from the top. I came this morning to give him his minute. Her voice did not break. It was steadier than the young man's had been. "You very nearly took it from me." Tomas Reach looked as though she had struck him, which would have been kinder. "But you didn't," she said. "You stopped." And then she did a thing I have turned over in my mind 100 times since. She reached out one gloved hand and laid it, very briefly, on the young man's arm, the way you would steady someone at the edge of a drop. It takes a harder man than most to stand still when everyone wants him to, and a harder one still to go quiet when he's already made his noise. You did the second thing. My husband spent his whole life at the first. She withdrew her hand. "Read the names on your way out. Read them slowly. That's all any of them ever wanted." She turned and walked away across the court, small and upright, and the crowd parted for her without being asked. Tomas Reach stood there with his dark phone and his shamed face, and the steward, who had come to throw him out, looked at the old woman's retreating back and then at the young man and seemed to lose all his grim purpose at once. "Go on, then," the steward said gruffly. "Out the west gate, and mind what she told you." It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more useful. It was a second chance with conditions, which is the only kind worth giving. I should tell you about Corwin now, because you will want to know what was happening behind that unmoving face while all of this unfolded 3 feet from him, and I am, as it happens, one of the very few men alive who can tell you. We had served together 6 years. We had stood 100 watches in the rain and the small dark hours. And one night 2 winters back in the guardroom, with the wind throwing sleet at the windows and both of us too tired to keep up the wall we usually keep up even with each other, Corwin Vale told me why the silence was the one duty he would never trade away. He had a brother, older by 4 years, the kind of older brother who is half a father to a boy. The brother had gone for a soldier and not come home, and he was not on the wall of the house of Ardenmore, because he had fallen far away in a place with a different flag and a different stone, and Corwin had been a boy of 14 at the funeral. And at that funeral, he told me, a man's telephone had rung. Right in the middle of the minute's silence over his brother's coffin, a bright, stupid, ordinary ringing, and the man had fumbled it and silenced it, but the damage was done. The minute was broken. And Corwin had stood there at 14 feeling the one whole thing he had left of his brother get cracked across by a careless stranger who would forget it by lunch. "I decided that day," he told me in the guardroom with the sleet on the glass, "that wherever I ended up I would be the man who keeps the minute whole, not for the rules, for the boy I was who lost his." He had said it flatly, the way he says everything, and then he had stood up and checked his kit for the morning watch, and we had never spoken of it again. But I never forgot it. And so I knew, standing beside him in the court of the fallen standard with Tomas Reach's careless laugh ringing off the granite, exactly what that minute cost Corwin Vale, and exactly why he would have died on his feet before he let it break. That is the thing about the men on the wall that the tourists never grasp. They think the stillness is empty. They think there is nothing behind the eyes, that we are furniture in fine red coats. The truth is the opposite. The truth is that the stillness is the most full thing in the court. It is brimful of the reasons each man has for keeping it, and the better the man, the heavier the cargo he carries without a tremor. Corwin was carrying his brother that morning. He had been carrying him for 20 years. And when a stranger walked in laughing and tried to crack the minute the way another stranger had cracked it long ago, Corwin did not break to stop him. He did the harder thing. He held so completely, so totally, that the laughing stranger had no choice in the end but to grow still and be carried too. Tomas Reach did not go straight out the west gate. I watched him cross to the wall instead, slowly, the way you approach something you have wronged. He stopped before the names. He stood there a long time, longer than the steward liked reading. I could not see which names, but I saw his shoulders change, the way a man's shoulders change when the abstraction of a place becomes the particular of a person, when some kind of memorial situation becomes a column of human beings who laughed and were cold and were loved and did not come home. And then he reached into his gray coat, and the steward stiffened, and I will admit my own hand drifted half an inch on the rifle, because we are trained to mistrust a sudden reach. He took out his phone. For one ugly second I thought he meant to start filming again, to get his clip after all, having learned nothing. The whole court seemed to think it too. There was a small intake of breath near the front. Instead, Tomas Reach turned the phone over in his hand, looked at it the way you look at something that has cost you more than you knew, and then, very deliberately in front of all of us, he switched it off. Not silenced. Off. The screen went black and he put it away in the deepest pocket of his coat, and he stood before the names of the House of Ardenmore with nothing in his hands at all. And from somewhere behind me, from the direction of the names, where there should have been no one at all, I heard a man begin, very softly, to weep. I could not turn, of course. But the cordon is set with its back to the wall, and so the wall is the one part of the court a guardsman cannot see and the crowd can. I watched the faces in front of me to learn what was happening behind me, the way a man reads a fire he cannot see by the light it throws on other faces. And the faces told me that someone had come out from the long shadow at the foot of the wall, where the morning sun never reaches, and an old man in a worn coat might stand all through a ceremony unnoticed, and that this old man was the one weeping. The boy in the school cap saw him first. I watched the boy's eyes go wide and wet, and then I watched the boy do a thing that no one had told him to do, a thing that came up out of him the way the truest things always do, unrehearsed. He left his mother's side. He walked, this boy of perhaps 10 in his too large school cap, straight past Tomas Reach and the steward and the murmuring crowd, to the old man at the foot of the wall, and he took the old man's hand. Now I could place it. Now the pieces of the morning fell together for me the way they must have already fallen together for the boy. The grandfather's name on the wall, the boy who had come to stand his minute for a grandfather, and the old man in the worn coat in the shadow who had also come, who had stood the whole ceremony alone in the cold because grief makes men hide in shadows, and who was, I understood with a certainty I cannot fully account for, the boy's other grandfather, the living one. Come to stand a minute for the brother he had lost in the same war, on the same wall, 60 years and 100 yards from where the old woman had come to stand a minute for her husband. Court understood it too. You could feel it move through the crowd, that wordless comprehension, the way warmth moves through a cold room. An old man, alone, weeping at the foot of a wall of names, and a boy crossing the whole court to take his hand. And it had so nearly been denied them. The minute that let an old soldier finally let go, 60 years on in the only place where the letting go is permitted, had so nearly been stolen by a laugh in a glowing rectangle. But it had held. Corwin had held it. And in the held silence, the old man had been able to do the thing he had perhaps waited 60 years to do, which was to stand among the names of the fallen and grieve without shame and without interruption, until a small hand found his. Tomas Reach was watching the boy and the old man. I saw the whole weight of it land on him at last, the full size of what he had nearly broken, and to his lasting credit he did not flinch from it. He stood and he took the weight, the way you must, the way Corwin took weight every hour of every watch. And then the old man at the wall did the thing that finished the morning. He let go of the boy's hand gently and he straightened himself. He was tall once, you could see it, before the years bent him. He set his worn coat right with both hands, the way old soldiers set their kit right before something that matters. And he turned to face the wall of names, and he raised his right hand slowly, the joints plainly paining him, and he held a salute. He held it for his brother. He held it the way it is meant to be held, the arm trembling but the line true, the eyes forward, and he was not a man in red wool. He was an old man in a worn coat in the cold, and it was the finest salute I have seen in 9 years on the wall. I will tell you what happened then, and you may believe it or not, but every man in the cordon will tell you the same. The crowd began to salute with him, not the trained, machine-perfect salute of soldiers, the other kind. The kind that ordinary people, who have never saluted anything in their lives, raise when something in them recognizes a thing too large to stand before with their hands at their sides. Men took off their hats. The boy in the school cap copied his grandfather's hand, badly, perfectly. Tomas Reach, after a frozen moment, raised his own hand. This young man who an hour ago had not known what the place was, and held it as best he knew how, which was not well, and it did not matter, because the not knowing had become the knowing right there in front of us all. 400 people, saluting a wall, because one old man had finally been able to grieve in peace, because the minute had held. And through all of it, Corwin Vale stood his post and did not move. That is what people get wrong when they hear this story told secondhand and ask why the guard did not salute too, did not unbend, did not have his moment. They have it backwards. The salute was possible only because he held. If he had stepped out of the cordon to silence Tomas Reach, the minute breaks and the old man never gets his piece and the boy never crosses the court and there is no salute. There is only a scuffle and a ruined morning. If he had unbent to join the saluting crowd, he would have stopped being the still point the whole thing turned on, and the meaning would have leaked out of it. His gift was the stillness. His salute was the not saluting. He was the one fixed thing in a court full of moving grief, and because he did not move, everything else was free to. I have thought a great deal since that morning about the difference between a man who cannot feel and a man who will not show it. The young man with the phone, when he came through the East Arch, would have told you the guard felt nothing, that the stillness was an emptiness. By the time he switched off his phone, he had learned the truth, which is that the stillness is the fullest and most disciplined feeling a man can offer, a feeling so complete it has no need to move. Corwin was not absent from that morning. He was the spine of it. The minute had been over for some time now, by the clock, but no one had moved to leave. The ceremony's formal close, the lone trumpet from the bell tower, had not yet sounded, and the whole court hung in the long, held quiet after the salute, 400 people unwilling to be the first to break a silence that had been so nearly lost and so dearly kept. The old man lowered his arm at last. The boy took his hand again, and in that suspended hush, the steward, who had wanted only to throw a fool out of the gate, stepped quietly back and let Tomas Reach stay. I thought that was the end of it. A hard morning held whole, a stranger humbled into understanding, an old man's grief given its due. It would have been more than enough. But the morning had one more thing to give, and it came, as the truest things do, from the most unexpected quarter, and it began when the captain of our cordon, a man not given to gestures, took one slow step forward out of the line. Captain Hale had stood the wall for 20 years before they gave him the cordon to command, and in all my time under him, I had never once seen him break the formation during a ceremony. He was harder about the protocol than any officer I had served. So when he stepped forward, I felt the whole cordon go tense beside me. 8 men wondering if we had read the morning wrong, if there was a reprimand coming, if the captain had decided that the breach by Tomas Reach demanded some official answer after all. He did not go to Tomas Reach. He turned instead and walked the few paces to the old man at the foot of the wall, the old man in the worn coat with the boy's hand in his. And Captain Hale, before the whole court, came to attention and saluted him. I understood it at once. The old man was a soldier. The captain had seen it in the salute, the way one soldier always sees it in another, the trembling true line of an arm that had been taught long ago and never forgotten how. And so the captain of the KingsGuard, in his red wool and his medals, was saluting an old man in a worn coat, not for any rank the old man held now, but for the wall the old man had a name upon, and for the brother the old man had come to grieve, and for 60 years of carrying a loss in silence into shadows at the foot of memorials. It was one soldier telling another, in the only language they both fully spoke, that the grief had been seen, and the service was remembered, and the long, lonely watch of mourning was, this once, shared. The old man's face came apart then, not into more weeping, into something better. He drew himself up, all of him, every inch of the tall man he had once been, and he returned the captain's salute, and for a moment the two of them stood there holding it, the serving officer and the old soldier, the boy looking up between them, and 400 people watching a thing they would tell their grandchildren about. I have stood many ceremonies. None ever held a moment that earned its silence the way that one did. Then the trumpet sounded from the bell tower. It came clear and high into the cold, the lone notes of the formal close, the call that ends the remembrance and releases the living back into their day. We have a name for it on the wall, an old name, but I think the old name does not matter here. What matters is that it sounded over a court that had been given its whole minute, unbroken, and over an old man who had finally been allowed to grieve, and over a young man who had come to take and had stayed to learn, and over a boy who would carry this mourning in him for 70 years, the way his grandfather had carried his. The captain held his salute until the last note died. Then he lowered his arm, gave the old man a single nod, the kind that says more than a speech, and walked back into the cordon and took his place, and was once again the hardest officer about the protocol I have ever served under, as though he had never stepped out at all. That is the discipline. It bends for the thing that is larger than the rule, and the instant the larger thing is honored, it stands straight again. A lesser man cannot tell the difference between the rule and the reason for the rule. A guardsman lives in the difference. The crowd began, at last, to move. They went slowly, and they went quietly, and almost every one of them turned aside on the way out to read the names, the way the old woman had told Tomas Reach to do, slowly. The boy and his 2 grandfathers, the living one and the carved one, went out together, the old man's hand on the boy's shoulder now. The old woman in the gloves had already gone, and Tomas Reach was the very last to leave. He came past the cordon on his way to the west gate, and he slowed as he passed Corwin Vale, and I thought he might speak again, might offer some second apology. He did not. He had learned in the space of 1 minute the thing that takes some men a whole life, which is that there are moments a man should not fill with his own voice. He simply stopped before Corwin, this young man who an hour before had thrust a glowing rectangle into a guardsman's face for a clip, and he looked at the still red figure with the rifle and the white gloves and the eyes fixed forward, and he came to attention, badly, earnestly, and he held the best salute he had in him. Then he walked out through the west gate with his phone dark in his deepest pocket and his head, for perhaps the first time in his life, properly bowed. Corwin Vale did not return the salute. Of course he did not. He was on duty in the cordon, and he had a post to hold, and a guardsman does not break for a tourist's salute any more than he breaks for a tourist's insult. But I was 3 feet away, and I will tell you what I saw, and it is the only movement Corwin made that whole morning. As Tomas turned to go, the white glove on Corwin's rifle tightened very slightly, the smallest possible closing of the fingers, a thing no camera could ever have caught and no stranger could ever have read. It was all the answer he allowed himself. It was, in his language, an entire speech. It said, "I saw it. It was enough. Go in peace." The court emptied. The trams ran. The flags flew full again. And the 8 of us stood the wall until our relief came at the changing of the watch, and not one of us spoke of what had happened, because there are mornings you do not cheapen with talk while the cold is still in the stone. I have stood many silences since. I expect I will stand many more before they take the red coat off my back and pension me into a quieter life. But I have never stood one without thinking of that November morning, and of the difference between the man who breaks and the man who holds. We live now in a loud age. Everyone has a glowing rectangle and a voice, and the unshakable conviction that the world owes them a reaction. The silences are getting harder to keep. There are more men like Tomas was, coming through the East Arch with their attention fixed on themselves, and fewer of the old kind, who know without being told what a place is and what is owed in it. And it would be easy, in such an age, to think the still men on the wall are relics, furniture in fine red coats, men whose great virtue is that they simply have not figured out how to react like the rest of us. I knew a man who could have told you the truth of it, and now I have told you in his place. The still man on the wall is not the one who feels the least. He is the one who feels the most, and has made of his stillness a wall to keep something safe behind. Corwin Vale carried a lost brother and 20 years of a boy's broken minute into that court, and he set them down beside the 500 names of the House of Ardmore, and he held so completely that an old man got his grief and a boy got his memory and a careless stranger got his understanding, and the dead got their due. He did not move. That was the whole of it, and it was everything. The minute, you see, was never the thing he was protecting. The minute was only 60 seconds. What he was protecting was the right of the living to give the dead something the world cannot buy back once it is broken, which is their full and undivided remembrance. And the only way to protect a silence is to be more silent, more still, more unbreakable than every careless thing that comes to break it. He stood it whole. He always did. And the last time the bell struck the hour over the court of the fallen standard, and 400 strangers held their breath together for 60 unbroken seconds, I knew exactly whose stillness had taught them how.